Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 1 in our study of Genesis chapter 42. And this week I'd like to welcome those who have joined us from the country of South Korea. Welcome to our Bible study. Hope you're enjoying it, and we'll look forward to studying with you as we continue on. We're going to finish off those last verses of chapter 41, and we've been looking at the case of Pharaoh and Joseph, where Pharaoh had called Joseph up. And if you recall, he had had those divinely appointed dreams. Joseph was able to decipher those for him and to explain those to him. And also, Joseph was able to give him advice on what they were to do. Because we notice where the dreams that he had, they were one and the same, and they were indicating that there were going to be 7 years of famine to come upon the land of Egypt. It was going to be a very grievous famine. It was going to be basically wiping out all of the crops and the cattle, and if they didn't properly prepare for it, they weren't going to be able to survive it. And so following, the first thing that was going to come on, there were 7 prosperous years, and then the 7 years of famine. So they were going to have 7 years to prepare and to get ready and to store things away, to put things away, and it told us they were going to take up, some of Joseph's advice to them was to take up a 5th part of the land and to appoint officers over the duties and over the procedures they were going to carry out in order to store up enough that they would be able to survive the 7 years of famine that were to follow. And then we saw where Pharaoh recognized that Joseph had the Spirit of God upon him. And he had asked his counselors there, he said, well, where can we find such a man as this in whom the Spirit of God is? And so we talked about that to some extent. And because of that, it was Pharaoh's recommendation to his counselors there and to everybody, all of his servants, that they would appoint Joseph as the overseer of this entire humongous operation that they were going to have to carry out. And so, of course, Joseph readily accepted that position, and we noticed where, God had appointed him. Everything that Joseph had been involved in, he had prospered at, and God was with him, and it was very noticeable to those around him. And so he was elevated into the second in command position. Pharaoh said he was only going to be greater in the throne only. He was going to be in just his leadership position, in his stately kingship, you might say. That's the only thing, it was kind of like just being that figurehead figure where he delegated all of his authority to Joseph, but yet he would still retain his kingship position. And so here we see that Joseph now is in second command over the entire country of Egypt. And with that, we're going to pick it up in verses 42 through 45 of chapter 41. And the Bible says, and Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and he cried, and they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or his foot in all of the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Wow, what a change of events. You think back in Joseph's life where he was being mistreated by his own family. His brothers didn't like him, they hated him. We saw where he had been thrown into a pit at one point in his life. And then he had been sold into slavery by his own family. His father had been told that he'd been basically killed and that he was no more. And then we saw where he was in Potiphar's household, and we saw where he got elevated in Potiphar's household, and then again got mistreated by Potiphar's wife and got thrown into prison once again. And then we saw where he got elevated in that position while he was in prison. And he was able to decipher those dreams and so forth. And now here we are, one more phase of his life, and he's second in command over the entire country of Egypt. What a monumental elevation of position. I mean, it's just incredible to think about, how he's moved from one end to the other, one end of the spectrum to the other. But what do we see Pharaoh doing here? Well, he wants to put Joseph in this position, and he wants him to have the authority, but he's got to have the people accept him in that position. He can't just send him out yet on his own and expect them to readily receive him and readily believe him and readily listen to his directions, especially the other servants and the other counselors and the other officers that are going to be appointed under him. He's got to be able to be in that position of respect and have the respect shown to him by all of those that are under him in order for this to be an effective venture that they're going to have to do. And so first of all, he wants to lay on him and position him with the significance of royalty. He's going to put royalty, make him royalty so that it'll substantiate his position. So what does he do? Well, he takes off his very own ring and puts it on Joseph's finger. I mean, this is a kingly ring. This is a ring of significance. This is a ring that designates him to be in that upper level position. Next, he takes clothes of fine linen, and think about it, just shortly ago he had on prison garments and probably had on tattered rags for all we know. But here he's got royal garments. These are very costly items, things that can only be purchased or afforded to members of the royal family. And Joseph's going to have those on. So he's going to be very noticeable to the people that he is a member of the royal family. And next he gets a gold chain put about his neck, a very expensive, costly piece of jewelry that's going to hang about his neck. Again, things like these, the clothing, the ring, the jewelry, those are all things that signified royalty. I mean, you think about it even today in many countries, if somebody's in that king or queen position, well, many times they may not wear them constantly or on a daily basis, but they have, say, for instance, the crown jewels that are at their fingertips, and they have access to them. And if they go out on certain events or maybe certain public events where they're going to be out in the public and basically being able to go out and make proclamations or just being out where people are going to see them, well, they're going to wear some of these items in order to just signify the royal position that they have. I mean, that's what they do. And then beyond that, he gives him the royal chariot, the number 2 chariot. It's his second chariot, which he had. So he's got the number 1 chariot, but he's got a number 2 chariot. Maybe it's the backup. Maybe it's kind of like in America we have Air Force One, and then they've got a backup Air Force One in case there's some mechanical difficulties, whatever. Well, he's given him Air Force Two, so to speak, to use, and so that's what he's going to be using. He's going to be using chariot number 2, the royal chariot, and so he's going to be able to present himself before the people and basically command them to show him respect and honor. Because what does it say? It says he sends people before him and they cry before him. They say, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. So he's got these criers that are going to go out before him and tell the people, look, here comes royalty. Bow the knee. Show your respect for Joseph and his position. And he's now ruler over all the land. And Pharaoh even goes to the extent that he says nobody's going to move their hand or foot. They're not going to move one iota or try to do one thing unless it's under your direction. Well, that's a lot of confidence that Pharaoh has put in Joseph. And why is it? Because he noticed, he was aware of that the Spirit of God was with him, that was in him. He knew that. And not only that, but it was validated by those dreams that he had. He had those divinely appointed dreams, and he recognized that. Even when he had those dreams, he recognized it. And then when Joseph came and was able to expound to him the meaning, the interpretations, well, then that just even confirmed it in his heart that these were from a divine origin. So he recognized that the Lord was with Joseph. And then we talked about perhaps he had already gotten the witness from Potiphar, perhaps, or even from the jailer, and they might have shared with Pharaoh about how he had wisely conducted business in those areas, and also how it was very noticeable that whatever he did came to prosper. And so Pharaoh was putting undiluted confidence in Joseph. He was putting the future of his whole country and his whole people in his hands. I mean, that's how much faith and trust that he had in his abilities to do the right thing, and that he was controlled and guided by God Almighty. And then lastly, we see that he seeks to fully equip Joseph for the position. He goes to the point of giving him a wife. He says, well, you're going to be in royalty. You need to have a royal wife too. And who is this wife? Well, she was in high standing. There's this Asenath, and she was the daughter of the priest of On. And so that was a high position. And that was going to be Joseph's wife. So he even provides him a wife of his own choosing. And he even gives him an official name to go along with his new office. So it's not going to be King Joseph or Prince Joseph or Officer Joseph. No, he's going to have an Egyptian name that is going to signify his position. And his name is this, and I could be pronouncing this wrong. I don't always look up these correct pronunciations, but I think it's Zaphnath Paneah is the way I'm saying it. And that literally means a revealer of secrets. So that's how Pharaoh's viewing him. You remember he called all the magicians forward. He called all of the wise men. He called everybody. And there were none that could give him those interpretations, that could reveal the secrets of those dreams. But Joseph did. And so he wants to give him that title that he's the revealer of secrets. How would you like to have that name to go around with? So he now has an Egyptian royal name. He's been grafted in to the family, you might say. And in other words, he's been naturalized and qualified by Pharaoh himself to be in this position. And Pharaoh's the only one that could grant him this office. So what do we see? Well, we see he's wearing Egyptian clothes. He's riding in an Egyptian vehicle. He's wearing Egyptian jewelry. He's holding an Egyptian office. He has an Egyptian wife, and even has an Egyptian name. So I would say with all of that, that qualifies him to be a citizen of Egypt. He's been grafted in. He's been welcomed in. He's been warmly attributed into the family now. Not only that, but into royalty. And so the last thing we see in this passage is this. It says, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So he was going to go out on a surveil trip. He was going to go out and survey the properties and survey the towns and survey the crops and take notes and have people taking notes for him and taking down suggestions that he's going to have and put down his advice into writings. And he's going to make these proclamations on how they're going to go about to these population centers and gather up these crops and gather up these cattle and gather up all of the things and put them in storage so that they're going to be ready when the time comes, and to make sure and ensure that the people are carrying out the requirements and the duties that's going to be they're going to have maybe law enforcement out there making sure that these things are being carried out, that his orders are being carried through. So he'll go out for this survey. He's going to inspect the land and all the doings of the people. And he will be also introduced and promoted everywhere he goes. I mean, they didn't have television. They couldn't put out the news, the daily news on the TV or on the radio. They probably didn't even have any, they didn't have Pony Express or anything. So the news would travel, but it would travel by word of mouth generally. And, if people are traveling around, they would spread but it would be a slow process. But he's going to go out and visit all these population centers, and it's going to be made known, and they're going to get the word out rather quickly because they've got to get they got to get the plan not only formulated, but they got to get it set up and organized and have it ready to go. But all will know his name, and all will know who he is in the land. Well, with that, we're going to pick it up here in these remaining verses, 46 through 57. And here the Bible says, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field which was round about every city laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as it was as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second was called he Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according to as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all the lands. Well, that's a pretty big passage there, but what is it telling us? Well, we're made aware of a more contemporary Joseph. I mean, the update on all that's transpiring, not only in his doings, but also in his personal life as well. And it's kind of interesting how sometimes the Bible will just kind of briefly allude to some of these events, but it lets us know that, Joseph has a personal life. I mean, he has a wife now, and they're making a family, and they're setting up camp. And so, just like anybody that goes out and has their duties to do every day or their job they have to go to, well, so does with Joseph. He's got a position to go to. He's got his daily activities, his daily duties, but he's also maintaining a family now. And the Bible alludes to that, it's not just all about him doing everything on his own, but he's got this family concerns as well and things back home to think about. We're made aware that when he was elevated to this position in Pharaoh's kingdom, he was also given this wife, and it tells us that when he stood before Pharaoh, he was all of 30 years old. So time had been passing on. He'd been through all of these events, and as time came to pass, then it was time for these events to take place. And he had to leave, the family. He had to go TDY. He had to go on temporary duty to go out and do these survey trips. And they weren't short trips. I mean, they couldn't just drive 300 miles in 6 hours. It took sometimes days or even weeks to get out of these places and to go to these different towns and different places they were going to. And sometimes he could be away for weeks at a time, or even months for that matter. But he was to go out and survey all of the properties and all of the lands and make sure that Pharaoh's plans, or the things that he had advised Pharaoh, were going to get carried out properly and in order. And so when these prosperous times came, well, then it was time to garner the corn and to store it up. And as they were gathering bumper crops, it says they gathered so much that you couldn't even number it. That's how much they were having to store away. So they had plenty, not only to sustain the people during that time, but they had plenty of overage where they could put it in store. The times were good. The times were ripe. The environment was conducive to getting these bumper crops of corn. And so they were enforcing storing the excess amounts in the storage areas and securing them for future use. And I'm sure they had guards there. I'm sure they had secured facilities to make sure that nobody was coming in and taking things that didn't belong to them. But when all these events were transpiring, as they were building the storage areas and so forth, well, Joseph was also building his family, because what does it tell us? It says he has 2 sons, and the first one was named Manasseh, and the second one was named Ephraim. And he named them according to his predicaments. And so, the fact that God had prospered him, and what did he tell us? It says he made him to forget all of his toil, made him to forget about his father's house, whether good or bad memories were associated with it. And so, in other words, he was just staying so busy, and he was so active, and he had so many responsibilities, that he didn't have time to sit around and dwell, or to even consider or to think about all the things that had transpired before. And that's why he says, God made me forget about those things, because I've got a new life. I mean, I got a new position. I got a new family. I got all of these major business responsibilities to take care of. And he's just, he's contented. I mean, but he recognizes it, and he still gives God the glory for it. So God had made him forget about all those things. And the fact that God had caused him to be fruitful in this time of affliction, and the fact that he was prospering by the Lord's command, by the Lord's provision. He'd endured affliction. He'd endured some sufferings and some hard times. He'd endured some loneliness and some, just missing his family and so forth. And, learning a new land and possibly learning a new language and so forth. I mean, he had endured a lot of hardships. But God had brought him through. God had made a way of escape, and God had promoted him. And God had prospered him through it all. He had served as an indentured servant, basically as a slave. He'd been ostracized from his family. He'd been falsely put into prison. And yet in every instance, God had prospered him. But sometimes fruitfulness and forgetfulness can be a detriment to a Christian. So we got to remember that. Sometimes when times are good and times are prospering and we've got all of our needs met and it seems like we lack nothing, then those are times when we can forget who gave us, who gives us our daily needs, who meets our daily needs. And we can even forget about God if we're not careful, and forget to fellowship with him, forget to talk to him, and forget to be thankful. And that should not be. Whether we're in hard times or good times, we need to be constantly alert and constantly in fellowship and in tune with our Holy Father. So it's interesting to see here that Pharaoh just had all of this confidence in Joseph, and the fact that he knew that he had carried those witnesses about him. But the people were plenteous and prosperous. Joseph's plans were carried out to the letter. And next, sure as his words had said, then the 7 years of Darth hit. Perhaps it quit raining. Perhaps a heavy wind came in. Perhaps they had some kind of plague of insects, or whatever the case is. But it was Darth, a huge Darth upon the land, and not only took place in Egypt, but it tells us that also the surrounding countries as well. It describes it as upon the whole earth. So everybody was in dire straits, but Egypt was the only one who had the wisdom to prepare for it, because they were the only ones that were privy to what the future was going to hold. And so the news soon traveled throughout Egypt, or soon traveled throughout the surrounding countries, that Egypt had bread. And Joseph saw to it that the storehouses were open, and he began selling to the Egyptians. Because what does it tell us? This is the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And then it was also alerted to the other countries, and they were traveling in the hopes of buying corn as well, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and pick it up here in chapter 42 in verses 1 through 6. And the Bible says, "Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, Why do ye look one on another? And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither, and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob, was sent not with his brethren. For he said, Lest peradventure mischief shall befall him. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over all the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth." Well, with that said, we see now the narrative's turning back to the land of Canaan. And we've been keeping up with all the escapades of Joseph for a while now, and now it's turning back to Joseph's family that he'd left behind, to Jacob and his 11 brethren. And what does it tell us? It says that they were also under this guise of the famine. And it's interesting to note that even though that Jacob's sons were married and had families, that they did choose to still live in the same community as their father and share together as one big family. They still worked under their father's directions. And so with that, we can make a few quick observations here. First of all, that the fact that Jacob's family is experiencing these famine conditions as well. And so Jacob, being the wise father that he is, he learns that there's possible sustenance in Egypt, which isn't that far to travel. And he says, he has his orders to his son. And he said, well, now get down thither and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And it's also interesting to note that the three patriarchs to whom Canaan was the land of promise, they all met with famine in that very land. So that is kind of interesting. That is the land of promise, the land of abundance, the land of their inheritance, and yet they all three of the great patriarchs met with famine in that very land. Well, we got some other observances we're going to make there before we see that Joseph's family is going to actually travel to Egypt to try to purchase some corn. And we're going to see a few things about that before it happens. But we'll pick it up there in these first 6 verses of chapter 42 in our next lesson. And I hope to see you again real soon. Thanks.